In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, we would like to welcome you to the second session of the second day, convened by Al Jazeera Centre for Studies in cooperation with Al Jazeera Mubasher, entitled International Competition in Africa, the motives, the stakeholders, or the different parties and dimensions. So we would like to look into the difference of strategies and contradictions in terms of these strategies. We would like to welcome our guests. In this session, we would like to concentrate on this level. So we'd like to welcome our guests from Meknes. We would like to welcome also from Nouakchott, Mr. Ismail Yaqub al-Sheikh. I would like to welcome you also. And from Addis Ababa, Mr. Noureddin Abda from Ethiopia. And also would like to welcome our guests from Limoges, Mr. Mohammed Torshin. We're going to have from Senegal, Dakar, Mohammed Mustafatin, researcher in African affairs. I would like to welcome our guests and the audience. So each of the guests is going to have 5 minutes. We would like to welcome Mr. Nabil Zagawi, researcher in politics and international relations, why the security of Africa has become important when it comes to the strategies of world powers. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, first of all, please allow me to extend my thanks to Al Jazeera Centre for Studies for this opportunity, the opportunity to take part in this research conference about international competition in Africa, particularly in the light of what was expressed by the director of the center. He talked about this continent as a distinctive continent. So we Africans are the ones who can express the concerns, the difficulties that we are facing as Africans. And to answer your question, please allow me to remind that the international concern vis-à-vis the security of Africa has started at the level of the United Nations, and the United Nations since the 60s of the 20th century has started settling disputes between neighboring countries in Africa based either on ideological polarizations after the Cold War, or as a result of conflicts on distorted borders that have been the results of the colonial period. But after the Cold War, the United Nations started thinking about security in Africa, settling conflicts within countries themselves, and these have manifested themselves as racial and civil wars. And on the other hand, Africa remained for international powers as a manifestation of wars, poverty, and hunger. And when it was called the Black Continent, it was not called so because of the color of the complexion of its people, but because of the darkness of this security quagmire. So this is how this continent was forgotten by these forces. After the 11th of September, Africa entered into a confrontation, and it was the line of confrontations, particularly after the appearance of extremist groups in Africa. So there were concerns that the continent would become a safe haven for hardline groups and extremist groups, and we have seen how Sudan was a safe haven for Al Qaeda. And after the decline of the importance of the Middle East due to increase in the price of the regaining of the security of that particular area. So, as a result of that, in recent years, we have seen that these great forces have started looking into Africa and the African countries that are rich in natural resources have attracted the attention of the international community. So, similar to individuals and groups within one state who try to compete over rare resources, the same applies to countries and states. These states they compete with each other in order to achieve utmost affluence. And so that is why these countries have been seeking to achieve their strategic interests and also the interest in the security of the continent is a means to find a secure context to protect the interests and also to guarantee the flow of these interests. So the increase in the demand for the security in Africa is not for social reasons for the sake of African people. No, it is for the interest of those powers that are benefiting from these resources. And here I would like to talk about the American and the African perspective of African security. So, the American perspective is a comprehensive perspective that looks into traditional concerns such as terrorism and the flow of oil in addition to a number of concerns, in addition to new security such as violations of human rights, human trafficking, and so on. But despite all that, the claims by America to reinforce democracy on the African continent, this is just a camouflage or a way to camouflage the wish to influence the continent. So, despite the fact that the European side is the most active in the continent, but it is also the ones that gives more developmental aid to the continent. So you've taken 6 minutes, so we're supposed only to have 4 minutes. So you're going to have the opportunity in the second phase of this segment to talk exactly about the point that you were talking about now. So please stay with us, and we're going to continue with the same idea afterwards. So we would like to give the floor to Mr. Yaqub Sidiya, and you have 4 minutes talking about the French hegemony and influence. Since you're interested in the Sahel region, why this has become a nightmare. So you have 4 minutes. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Al Jazeera Centre for Studies for the trust and confidence, and I would like to thank Al Jazeera Mubasher, and I would like to thank the network as a whole. I would like to welcome the distinguished guests that have preceded us in following this conference. So the French influence, and if we want to study the situation, and after the intention to partially withdraw from Mali or the Sahel in general, and this is part of political maneuvers more than a reality. And we have to go back to history. So France, between 1830, when it enters Algeria, and 2006, was very much concerned with its security through Africans at the expense of Africans. So we'd like to take snippets here. So history is very important. 1 million African soldiers have helped France in the First World War. And when we say helped, so we talk about countries of tropical Africa and West Africa. They were all under the colonial power with some exceptions some of them under the control of Ghana and other countries, and Guinea-Bissau and other countries. And to a lesser extent, the German colonialism in Togo that did not last for a long period of time. France benefited from African blood. In 2006, it was a turning point. So there, what started is the security interest. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was no longer as it used to be. But in 2006, Russia started entering the region from a security perspective. So I think that there are two factors here. So the first factor is the failure of Barkhan forces. They failed in their mission, and this has aggravated the situation. And we have seen an increase in the number of violent extremists in the Sahel region. And also, geographically speaking, the situation has expanded. And also, we have had Libya that was dismantled, fragmented through French hands. So France committed suicide under the African guillotine, if we may call it so. So we talk about 8 operations, military operations. And whenever there is a military intervention or interference, there is a Russian military intervention, either through security companies or military agreements. And this was the first reason. The second reason, France supported since 1962, and since the proposal that was presented to Jacques de Gaulle, Jacques Foccart, the spiritual father of this tendency. Since that time, France started supporting military coups and started supporting military dictatorships. So, as if they are interested only in democracy within this hexagon, and what is beyond that is of no interest to France. So this was a rejection of the new elite that was born in the new nation state. And I think that France is paying the price of these two components that I have just mentioned. Please stay with us. I would like to move to another guest and talk about another theme. Mr. Nuruddin, talking about Africa as being a vassal continent, vassal to others. So French speaking countries have decided to change from the French franc and move from the French franc. How can we read this transformation or change? I cannot hear you very well. Can you repeat the question? We talk about African dependence being a vassal continent. Some have called for reforms to the French franc and change it to have the eco as a new currency, and they're going to stop depositing 50% of their currency reserves in the So I would like to thank you very much. I would like to thank the dear guests and the dear audience with you here. When we look at Africa and attempts to put an end to the colonial impact, we see that there were challenges during that period of time. And after the end of this enthusiasm. So we have seen a phase where a real confrontation of reality, and these challenges are such as economic and security challenges, and also internal and regional issues and challenges. And in order to overcome these challenges that have come to the surface, the African leaders have an option that is not easy at all. So either they accept conditional, politically conditional support through positions regionally and internationally, or they accept another option that might be much more dire, and to accept the Chinese support, and that would be perhaps a much more bitter kind of option. And it seems that there is a great deal of acceptance to find a way out from the bottleneck. So there is an acceptance of a larger role, a more support or more level of support by China when it comes to economic structures and other infrastructures. So this is a challenge that is very, very important indeed, and still will by some countries, and we can say that Ethiopia has an independent kind of view, and officials here say that a large part of the differences that exist with the West in general and America in particular when it comes to the internal crisis in Ethiopia, a lot of this crisis is to do with the relationship with China, and the West wants African countries in East, North, or West. The West wants them to be a spearhead in the crisis within the West, or between the West and China, the West, America, and China. That is why this difference, this disagreement, is due to this manifestation, or the manifestation of this conflict between the different positions and the Ethiopians are asked to be part of this American campaign or agenda to confront China. But Ethiopia, by nature, if we look at what it represented historically speaking, so Ethiopia sees that it should play a very important role when it comes to the independence of the resolutions or decisions undertaken by African continent. So Africa underlines the importance of reinforcing regional institutions, and Ethiopia has been very keen on keeping the solutions in the hands of Africans when it comes to the Libyan conflict or other conflicts as well. So the when it comes to the Libyan dossier, due to the intersection of interests by so many countries, this has made the dossier leave the hands of the African Union to be controlled by these countries that have interests in Libya. So there are so many challenges, and some of the challenges are economic. And also, we have to take into account that Africa is not a unified country, so a unified continent. So I would like now to move to another guest, Mr. Mohammed Turchin. to give him the opportunity to talk about promising African models. Mr. Mohammed Torshin, we have had a number of rising African models such as South Africa, Angola. What are the challenges that these countries are facing? And you have 4 minutes. I would like to thank you very much. I would like to thank Al Jazeera Centre for Studies, and I would like to thank Al Jazeera Mubasher for this opportunity with regard to the situation in Africa. So the international conflict or competition has gone through many phases. It started in Berlin and Berlin Conference. And we have had the second phase, which was the Cold War phase, and this was in the light of competition that has happened between traditional powers, France, Britain, Portugal, Belgium, and now we can say we have reached the third phase of this competition over Africa, although there are a number of promising models, but we can divide the African countries into four groups. We have the first group, which is the group that can achieve great gains in the line of such a situation because these countries have a good register when it comes to human rights. They have good indicators when it comes to human rights, and also they have good transfer of power. So we talk about countries moving from Algeria, Senegal, Algeria, Egypt. We should not forget also Kenya. So these countries have met all the conditions that have been set by the international community after the fall of the Soviet Union. So consequently, we have seen that these countries have achieved some stability in addition to the peaceful transfer of power. So consequently, these models of competition between these regional powers, they aim to get resources and so on and so forth. So one country cannot impose its will on those countries at a large extent because these countries they own large spaces of maneuver, and we find that Rwanda economically cooperates with the United States, with China, with Russia, and other rising countries such as Turkey, India, Qatar, the Emirates, and other countries as well. And these models can achieve great gains for their people and they can reach good prosperity. And there are some other models where it is very difficult to dissociate themselves from this group, such as the African franc group. So these countries are historically associated with France, with the exception of Senegal, that has been classified in the first group. It is very difficult for the second group to dissociate itself with France. And there is cooperation between Europe and America with matters to do, when it comes to matters to do with terrorism and investment. So perhaps we're going to see an expansion of the Russian and Chinese model because there is strategic cooperation in many, many matters in the economy and arms deals, and also European influence between Russia, China, Turkey, and Iran to some extent. So these countries can be considered amongst the countries that are in South Africa, South African region, such as Angola, Zimbabwe, and so on and so forth. So these countries, they communicate very well. So the United States of America has left these countries alone and has perhaps left a vacuum for the other countries to fill that vacuum. So Zambia has left so many of these companies, oil companies, in favor of China. So these models, we cannot perhaps dissociate themselves from that component. Let's go back to the fourth component. You're going to get another 2 minutes. We have the conflicting countries between the United States, China, and Russia, and also the countries of interest are Central Africa, and so on and so forth. So these countries are very important strategically speaking. So these countries, they try to confirm the agreement that was about the Flamingo military base and also the situation in Central Africa. So now they were able to put an end to the opposition. So also we have the Mali model. So Russians have a great deal of influence over Mali, and also Libya is divided. So some parts are influenced completely by the Russians, and some other areas are influenced by other countries. I'm really sorry for having interrupted you. Uh, so I would like to move to another guest. So I would like to move to our guest, Mr. Mustafa. So, what about this phase? Does it impact the relationships? So, you have 4 minutes. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. First of all, I would like to thank Al Jazeera Centre for Studies and Al Jazeera Mubasher, and I would like to thank Dr. Muhammad Al Mukhtar Khalil, Director of Al Jazeera Centre for Studies, and I would like to salute our guests who are attending this conference, and I would like also to thank the organizers of this African International Conference. If you can repeat the question, please. Yes, go ahead, sir. We can hear you. So, Arab African relations have developed and have gone through many phases since the beginning of the African Union. So, when the African Union was established in 1963, there were good Arab African relations, particularly when Abdel Nasser and the Senegali president they organized a conference in Dakar, a conference at the ministerial conference at the level of foreign ministers. So this was a very important conference. Also, we have to say that there is a very good Senegali Moroccan relationship, and the same applies to the relationship between Senegal and Egypt. And also, the trade relationship is very important, and the cultural level is also very important. So, there are many factors that reinforce this relationship through our history. So, there are a number of factors. So we have the regional factor, and we have the cultural factor and the religious factor. So when it comes to the regional factor, this factor is amongst the most important factors that are the basis of the relationship between Arab countries and the African continent. So half the Arabs live in Africa. Half the Arabs live in Africa. So 27% of African land is owned by Arab countries. So this is when it comes to the geographical dimension. And we have to say that there is a African culture and an Arab culture. So there is a very important linkage between these two cultures. And also we have a good neighboring relationship with Morocco, between Morocco and Senegal, and between Morocco and Cote d'Ivoire, between Morocco, Mali, and Guinea-Bissau. These are historical relationships between Morocco and the other countries. We have the religious factor or component, or the religious relationship between African peoples and the Arab peoples. So many Africans are Muslim. So we have so many relations with the Arab world through the factor of religion. So the relationship between the Arabs and the Africans is very, very strong. There are thousands of Africans that go to study in the Arab world and work also in the Arab world, and they come back to their own countries to develop the teaching and study of the Arabic language. I was in Egypt amongst thousands of expat Africans who studied in Al-Azhar, and these Africans are ambassadors in those Arab countries. So the most important factor that had to be underlined by African leaders is to give the opportunity to Arab students as well in Africa. So what is required? And this particular point is going to be underlined in the coming theme, but please stay with me. I would like to move now to Mr. Nabil Zagawi. Mr. Nabil, we talk about the challenges. What are the security challenges that Africa faces? And you have 3 minutes. First of all, we have to remind that security is the outcome of many interactive factors because the internal and external points of influence are very important indeed, and security should happen between or within a certain kind of framework, and also within a methodology that would enable Africa to confront these factors. So international competition on Africa, military competition on Africa, conflicts over ports in order for these international powers to get hegemony and also influence over these Arab countries. So these are factors that are very important indeed. And there are regional challenges that also should be taken into account. So, with the exception of some border challenges between Eritrea and Djibouti, and also some interferences and attacks on Congo by Rwanda, and also the fact that those who have committed genocide have been held accountable. We have also known state actors, so all of them, they face these armed groups. So although there is tension between Cameroon and Nigeria, at the time when Boko Haram from Nigeria constitutes a huge military challenge when it comes to Cameroon. Also, we have the maritime policies in the Nile Basin. They also constitute challenges when it comes as to how to use the Nile water. And also we have other challenges as well, such as piracy and so on and so forth. And there are a number of local challenges, such as the fragmentation of African identities. Yes, this is not something that leads all the time to conflicts because there are limited demands for separatism, but this leads to opportunities that can be taken advantage of by the other interested groups. And also, we have the wars that are ethnic or religious conflicts and wars, such as in Nigeria between the North and the South, between Muslims and Christians, and also issues such as IDPs and refugees that run away, from conflict zones. And also there are some other issues, economic problems that lead to very fragmented regions, because this can be an area that would be suitable or a stronghold for Daesh or ISIS, for instance, particularly in the light of other local organizations such as Shabab al-Mujahideen in Somalia that was able to use these vacuums, these areas, in order to prepare and train for attacks in countries such as Kenya. So there are also some challenges, some problems and issues, and there are a number of rebel groups that are rebelling against their countries due to conflicts. Yes, Mr. Nabil, please stay with us. So we'd like to talk about this impact and would like to give the floor to Mr. Sidi Mohammed. Mr. Sidia, this French influence, it has retreated, and this is in favor of who? In the interest of who? The people or who? So this hegemony or influence, if it regresses, this is going to be in the interest of the new players and the old players, knowing that France had 5,000 soldiers in the Sahel region, and tactically speaking, it is going to withdraw its forces in 2021 or the beginning of 2022. And President Macron is not under too much pressure because Marine Le Pen, who is the main opposition member who represents the far right, is not for the withdrawal of France from Sahel unless the left or the extreme left or the Green parties make it to power. So then the situation is going to be different. But now Macron is not under any pressure because Marine Le Pen does not put any pressure in this regard. And even her supporters do not pressure. When Idriss Déby died and Brahim Babar Keita also was toppled. And after that, we have had a president from the Arab minority. So he is going to be the new ally. So the Russian influence has become very, very clever, and it started interfering from a security perspective.
The Russians interfere, and there will be a reduction of the French role. And if this happens, that will be for their own interests. The French will keep this fighting squadron in Chad and the one in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso in terms of the drones, in addition to the AWACS spying in Dakar, the Senegal capital. They will remain there, but the infantry unit in Mali will be reduced, and they might go to Niger. But now we have 600 troops, 250 non-French. They will be a special force there, and because of ISIS coming in the desert, and Abu Walid al-Sahrawi is the commander there, and they got rid lately of the commander of Boko Haram, who's not an ally of ISIS. So there will be two ICs cooperating in Niger. So Barkham Center will switch and change. And the Americans as well will increase their AFRICOM, but there are new players whose presence there is mainly for economic reasons such as Turkey, China, and India. And he is trying to stop the speaker and interrupt him. And okay, now please stay with us. We go to Nuruddin Abda. Mr. Nuruddin Abda, what are the alternatives for Africa? For he says I cannot hear the question. Mr. Nuruddin Abda, what are the alternatives now that Africa can have in order to compensate if they were to get rid of the influence of the West? The guest says the alternatives should be taken into account. Africa is not one single unit, and many discussions focus on the sub-Sahara Africa. So they are not one single unit. Therefore, internally, they need reforms and attempts to unite, to have a clear agenda. This is part of the big challenge, and this has been looked into, and in this case it will be an alternative. The free trade area there and the free market in Africa face a challenge, which is putting clear legislations and enacting them to liberate the movement of people and commodities. So Africa should enhance this vision to be a pan Africa, and this is a challenge. And personally, I think that there is a big gap now in the needs of pan Africa between North Africa and sub-Sahara Africa, and maybe many blocs in the north would like to enhance the Euro-Mediterranean partnership rather than pan-African partnership. And the behaviors of those countries go along these lines. So in general, the only way is to enhance those policies and for Africa to come out and face those challenges in a way that will enhance its partnership. Also, the African countries, many of their crises, irrespective of the international terror problem, and this is because of their international relations. But Africa needs internal reforms within their political systems to bring about political stability and to build on what has been achieved. But in many areas, there is now going back and weakening of creating stability. The presenter is trying to interrupt him. Mr. Nuruddin, stay with us. Now we go to Muhammad Turshid. Mr. Muhammad Turshid, speaking of the promising paradigms, Ghana is a prominent one that's successful politically. How was it able to change things positively? Of course, this is a promising, bright paradigm, and Ghana was able to put the blocks for democratic transformation through phases of similar examples of African countries. The military is trying to take over power, and the tribes and the big ethnic groups also try to have control. But through political open dialogues and through the realization of the military and the social blocs, they know that no one single entity can exclusively obtain power. So that had a role in putting the main blocks for stability and peaceful transformation of power. Not only Ghana, but even Kenya also succeeded from the one party system to a pluralistic system based on transfer of power peacefully and freedom and good governance. But despite that, many political elites in Ghana now consider that what's happening now is a setback because now there are youth campaigns speaking about corruption. Despite that, there was a reflection that despite those African promising paradigms are going forward, but there is corruption. There is corruption, and we see now Jacob Zuma in South Africa accused of contempt of the judiciary. So, despite that, these are promising paradigms, but these are reforms dealing with corruption because many international companies and especially the Chinese example have conducted studies in terms of to how to infiltrate into the African leaders, and they found the system of bribery and other procedures to do that. So most leaders now in most of the promising countries are accused of bribery and corruption. So this needs to be revisited, and those parties and the civil society should do internal reviews to overcome those problems of corruption and money laundering and getting into deals and contracts that their countries do not need, such as arms deals. Jacob Zuma is accused of it in 1999, especially French companies who paid him bribes. So these are good examples, but they do need to be restructured. And Rwanda is an example because Rwanda succeeded economically, but in terms of human rights and peaceful transfer of power and departing the one party system did not succeed in Africa. So, despite these are good examples, but they do need to be reformulated in terms of governance and combating corruption. And some parties now are turning into the one party system. Now, Muhammad Mustafa, Dr. Muhammad Mustafa, you spoke about Arab African relations. How can these be developed, and what are the main development sides that are common, especially that we have examples, and instead of them being an example of cooperation, now we see conflict between Ethiopia and Egypt in terms of the Renaissance Dam and the impact on the downstreams countries. How can we go for successful examples and stay away from the failed examples? Thank you. The development of Arab African relations comes in the context of enacting laws or international agreements that are binding for many of the policies of African countries. They must be changed. The laws enacted or the international agreements or conventions that are binding to some systems in Africa. This is an impediment of Arab African relations. For example, Senegal or another country is binded that their dealing should be with France. This is an economic impediment to a large extent, and since France has influence in Senegal and other West African nations. So the first element to develop Arab African relations for the countries in the west of Africa is to change the international binding agreements or conventions which are not to the interest of the African peoples. And for Arab African relations, of course, we have a lot in common with the Arab peoples, as I said. Some historical, cultural, geographical, economic, and religious. So, developing Arab African relations, therefore, is very easy, easier than developing African French relations, for example. We were harmed to a large extent because of our relations with France. French companies control West Africa and Senegal in terms of oil and gas sectors and everything. So when there are agreements or conventions that are new and benefit the African peoples and could contribute to changing the internal policies, the sound is lost, audio is lost. Dr. Muhammad Mustafa Teen, please continue. Yes. For example, Qatar or the UAE or Saudi Arabia, the relationship with Senegal and countries in West Africa, we lost audio again, unfortunately. We have a problem in audio. We'll come back to Dr. Muhammad Mustafa Teen. But now we go with another round. Each question should be answered in 2 minutes. Now we go to the future of prospects of security. What are the reforms needed for the security sector in Africa? First is what we see the Western donors doing as a way to change African countries in a way to serve their own interests and not necessarily to improve the situation for the local populations. In addition to security reforms, when it's done by external parties, this doesn't take into account the nature of the country in Africa. So African countries are weak, disintegrated, and they cannot be carrying out real reforms for security because despotism leads to fragile countries and lead to wars and conflicts, and that cannot bring about true reforms for the security sector. So, transferring transformation to peace is the best way to reform, because countries going into best practices would lead to progress when there is a transformation from despotism to democracy. So, other countries did not till now reach the stopping of conflicts and moving to build peace and security. So the role of external parties now here is important, because they can put agendas for security for weak and fragile countries, and here maybe those external parties would harm the concept of comprehensive security reforms, and that calls for fair partnership between Africa and the West, a partnership that would accept that African countries also have national interests, and in the absence of that, the African solutions for Africans remains the best. And here we need a regional system to guarantee the security of African countries, where they will be able to support local efforts to maintain security. Thank you. Stay with us. We go back to Sidia, Mr. Sidia. What's the future of France and Africa, and how will it be?
France would have to remove that image of the former colonial power and replace that by the current partner, or the and it has to be more generous, and it should let go of the tendency to take more than it gives. So, and also the African franc is going to be substituted with the eco currency, and France is going to continue being present in its colonies, but in a different form. So, Takuba is going to substitute for this presence. So this is going to be a strategic part. That this should be a strategic partnership and not a security partnership, because the trait of the former colonial power is going to remain. This is a stigma that is going to remain. Mr. Nuruddin, how is Africa going to save itself, rescue itself from new colonialism? As it was indicated, so this is not an easy challenge. The old colonialism was a material colonialism with direct presence, and there was a great deal of difficulty that the African countries have faced in order to overcome security and economic challenges and many other challenges that have been referenced by the speakers. So African countries always seek a supporter, but in actual fact, there is no such thing as a support without a price. Western support equals a large political price to be paid, and also a strategic economic price to be paid. But sometimes some would incline to say that perhaps these African countries would benefit from this political Western price that would lead perhaps to, because those Westerners would perhaps achieve things such as the establishment of democracy. Perhaps the political elite would benefit from that in order to reinforce good governance and fight corruption. So, if a balance is achieved between the interests of the Western powers and Africa, this perhaps can lead to overcoming so many of the challenges, such as the absence of democracy and so on. So, Chinese support perhaps can be a solution to some emergency issues and some timely problems. Because the Chinese might give some support when it comes to infrastructure, but when it comes to debt, and so many of those debts are channeled into the support of corruption. So much of such Chinese support is channeled into corruption. So there are so many reports dedicated to this particular matter. So this quick support can lead perhaps to having some painkillers to the issues and matters that Africans suffer from. And perhaps these African countries would be able to benefit from such support to have a real infrastructure. But the challenge, we have to say, is very, very big. Perhaps the experience of Ethiopia in the Renaissance Dam might be useful, and perhaps they might benefit from after exiting from these differences and disparities. So I would like to move to another guest talking about the promising models. Mr. Torshid, how do you see the future of economic reform and political reform in Africa? So the future of economic and political reform in Africa, we cannot take it in general because there are so many different views and trends. There is a good model, although that there are so many impediments that the Tunisian model is facing. So Tunisia is amongst the only countries that have benefited from the change that has happened. Libya is still living in conflict, and there was a setback in Egypt, and the same applies to Syria, which is very far away from our countries geographically. So the Tunisian models would need some reforms, perhaps to dissociate the regime, the ruling power from the parliamentarian power. I think the two systems should be separated in order to overcome any problematics that might arise. So many regional powers and international powers do not want economic reforms to happen in Africa. They want totalitarian regimes to prevail, and they do not want such reforms to happen and materialize on the ground. So we as Africans, as CSOs, as ruling political parties should try to develop an African model, because all these countries that we see that have stable political systems, good records of human rights, peaceful transfer of power at the level of the state or political parties, in addition to rights, social justice, these models were the outcome of a number of experiences. So all political elites should give themselves the opportunity to continue in power and also to have stable democracy. And the military establishments that have become means in the hands of certain powers in order to foil this democracy or this emerging democracies as we have seen in Chad or Mali or even in Egypt. So this model that is was looking forward to be established during the Cold War. So people in general should confront these aberrations and violations. And Sudan is trying to dissociate itself from this kind of tendency when the military establishment tries to control the legislative and executive powers. So political and economic reform requires a national elite, a will in order to put an end to the situation of vassal states, of dependent states. So there should be a model which is based on Africa first in order to benefit from our resources, and power should not be in the hands of the state only. So we'd like to Mr. Muhammad Mustafa Tin, our guest, talks about Africa and talks about the future. What is the future of Arab African relations and the impact of Arab Springs on the Horn of Africa and other African regions in 2 minutes, please. I would like to thank you. I was talking about the future of Arab African relations. I would like to say that the Arab African relations and in particular Western African countries and Arab countries, their relationship should be much stronger than it is currently. With regard to countries such as Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Emirates, they had a lot of investments in Senegal and West Africa, but we have seen a decline in recent years in terms of investments. When we talk about the future of Arab African countries and the impact of the Arab Spring on West Africa, the impact is very large from a security and economic perspectives. When the revolution erupted in Egypt in 2011, and I'm an eyewitness, I used to be there. And I saw the eruption of the revolution. And when the uprising or revolution moved to Libya, we have seen the negative repercussions on the African continent, particularly Western Africa, West Africa, from a security perspective. So in Mali, in areas such as Tombouctou and Gao have been impacted. There is a lack of stability since the beginning of the Libyan revolution. So there is a great deal of expansion when it comes to terrorist acts. So these are the negative impacts of the Arab revolutions. Economically speaking, sorry to interrupt you. Are there any positive impacts? The Arab Spring revolutions, my guest talked about the Tunisian model. So, in less than a minute, have there been any positive impacts when it comes to the Arab revolutions? So, in addition to the negative impacts of the Arab revolutions, there are positive also impacts. The African people, they feel that they have to carry out an uprising and also to let go of French policies that have impacted the whole of Africa. There are new opposition members who want to get rid of French policies, and this was declared and announced to everybody. So these are the positive impacts of the Arab or Arab revolutions. So there is also awareness raising as a result of Arab revolutions, and that they should not uh, blindly follow the policies of heads of states that are dependent on France. Mr. Muhammad Mustafa, please stay with us. Distinguished guests, we're going to go now to the social media segment, and after that, we're going to come back to our guests to comment. So we're going to listen to the comments of our guests. So the increased competition, international competition, is it going to lead to more looting of African resources? So they are all trying very hard to loot the resources of Africa. So, as everybody knows, these natural resources are in Africa. Neither Europe nor China want to develop Africa. They just want to steal and loot these resources. Muhammad Ahmed said the same. He said these are gangs that only try to steal people in general and Africa in particular. And Muhammad Saeed, we should not blame Africa or China, or Europe or China. We have to blame those who help them loot and steal our resources. So he's talking about the beneficiaries in Africa. So if these are stopped, nobody would be able to steal anything. Mr. Abdel Ghafour said, the world does not believe in the weak. You either are effective or you are not, or taken advantage of. We're going to give you 1 minute each to comment on what the audience had said. So if you can comment, please. What attracted my attention in these feeds, they concentrated on the curse of African resources, and this is the reason behind all crises that the continent suffers from. I think that access to such resources is what leads to these wars that have been taking too long. So when resources are looted, are stolen, so this would lead to violent conflicts. That is why conflicts in regions that have rich resources, these conflicts stay much longer compared to areas where fighters get external support or local support. Please stay with us. So the models that you have chosen expressed some concern, some unhappiness vis-à-vis the African situation, and most of the tweets came from speakers or an audience from West Africa. So we have 200 million Arabs from Africa, and this leads me to say that Africa has benefited from the Arab Spring. Mr. Ashur, you were asking the Senegalese guest to talk about or say one positive thing. And I would like to mention that Burkina Faso was able to topple 27 years of dictatorship through a black spring. And this was as a result of the impact of the Tunisian Arab Spring. So it was not an easy way. It was a very thorny pathway, and it was a source of influence. The Tunisian Arab Spring was a source of influence to other African countries. The relationship also between Mauritania and Senegal and this expansion. So this is something that we have to be aware of. So the Arab world as a whole, and particularly African Arabs, have African neighbors, including Sudan, which is neither on the Mediterranean nor on the Atlantic Ocean. And I agree with all those guests who have expressed themselves on social media. Mr. Ashur, I have not taken longer than the time allocated, and perhaps you should give me the time that was not given to me. So we just wanted the comment for 1 minute. I don't mind if you take an extra minute since you talked about time. You told me that I was beseeching my guest from Senegal. No, I just asked questions and the guest would answer the question. You have 1 minute. So the referee in a football match would have a stopwatch to know the time that was lost for that time to be regained and given again to the players because I was not lengthy. France, and here I would like to remind you that and these are questions that have been posed by you to the different speakers. Since myself and our Moroccan and Senegalese speakers are the closest to Mali, I think that the surprising withdrawal of France from Mali is going to lead to catastrophes in the region, similar to what has happened when it interfered surprisingly in Libya, and our Senegalese friend talked about that. So these fighters, they reached Tombouctou and Ifugas, and this power is still there. And the French, they know that. But Barkhane has achieved many, many gains against their enemies. But this has aggravated the situation and has led to more violence. We really would have wanted to stay with you for a longer period of time, but I would like to listen to your comments about what the audience or the different members of the audience that have expressed themselves on social media. So talking about the curse of resources, so this perhaps would underline our regrets and concerns as Africans and Arabs because some of these resources have been the reasons behind these conflicts that have happened in Africa. But we have to mention something very important: the failure of Africans in general in managing their own resources and rationalizing the use of these resources, and their inability to deal with these resources to build African citizens in keeping with the requirements of the century. This is part and parcel of this setback. This is part and parcel of this issue. So considering this blessing a curse is not the solution, but also we have to try to look into the problem and try to benefit as much as possible from these resources. And we hope that the coming phase is going to be much better. So please stay with us, Mr. Nuruddin. Mr. Torshin, you have 1 minute, please. With regard to the comments that have been expressed, this underlines that what is happening now is similar to the saying that says we should not cry over spilled water, or spilled milk, sorry. So this is very important indeed. We have to seek to find solutions because all regional and international powers, they seek to achieve their interests. So these regional powers, they want to achieve their interests, and this is not something that we should be working on. We have to work for the well-being of our people, and also to have national projects that are going to be helpful and beneficial to Africa for the interests of Africans, without being dependent on other countries. Please stay with us. The last comment to Mr. Muhammad Mustafa Tin. Mr. Muhammad Mustafa, I would like you to comment on the comments given by the different members of the audience. So I have a very small comment. When I was talking about the collateral damages of the Arab Spring, amongst the collateral damage of the Arab Spring, when Senegalese felt that they were oppressed, and that the previous government wanted or the previous government or the previous head of state wanted his son to be the new head of state, to make him inherit power. So we have seen what has happened in Senegal after 20 years. All this feeling, all these uprisings were the negative repercussion, one of the negative repercussions of Arab Springs. I would like to comment and say about the different tweets that say that the world does not show any interest in weak persons. I call upon our Arab neighbors to invest in Senegal and try to achieve sustainable development. We have gone beyond the time allocated to this seminar. We have come to the end of this fourth and last session in this conference that was convened by Al Jazeera Centre for Studies in cooperation with Al Jazeera Mubasher, and the title was International Competition over Africa. I would like to thank our guests. We would like to thank Dr. Nabil Zagawi from Meknes. Thank you very much. And also from Nouakchott, I would like to thank Mr. Siddiya. Would like to thank you so much. And from Addis Ababa, from Skype, Noruddin Abda, we would like to thank you so much. And from France, would like to thank Mr. Mohammed Torshin. Thank you so much. And I would like also to thank from Dakar, Mohammed Mustafa Teen, researcher in African affairs. I would like to thank our dear audience. We would like to thank you very much and would like to see you once again in our coming conferences. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all.